So, Chris, why don't you tell us a little bit about your career and life journey and what led you to be the chief architect at Ascent?
Sure. Um, so I'm originally from Boston. I went to school just outside Boston at Owen College. Um, After college, my degree was electrical and computer engineering, and I wanted to go into hardware engineering. Um, I found myself doing a side project with my friend at school that was a software project. We were trying to get people addicted to something that was good for them. My friend was playing The Sims all the time, and he was like, "Why do I make my Sims like go to the gym, but I don't do that myself?" So we were thinking, how can we use those gamification techniques to push people towards something that's good for them? So we wanted to teach people how to cook, and so we were doing this side project. And the whole time I was like, man, I better not get too good at software or I'm going to end up a software developer instead of a hardware developer. And lo and behold, here I am, 15, 20 years later, through and through a software developer. Um, I just really fell in love with the fast feedback, being able to have an idea about how to solve someone's problem and get that solution made pretty cheaply and in front of them in a matter of days or weeks versus hardware you're often further from the customer and the cycles are much longer. And I really felt like that fast feedback was important for me, especially just starting my career, to help me just continue growing and learning as fast as I could. So that's really what set me not only on the software path, but on the startup path. So out of school, I worked at really my whole career a succession of startups, and the big reason that I gravitated towards startups was because of that fast feedback. At a startup, I felt like I was going to be one out of 10 people, one out of 20 versus one out of 200 or 2,000. By definition, you're an important part of that team. Um, and so I wanted to put myself in those situations where I was going to have, the autonomy, the responsibility that I don't know. In retrospect, maybe I wasn't always ready for, but I was looking for the challenge because I felt like that's how I'm going to get the feedback that I'm going to need to be able to grow and learn and do the things that I want to do. Um, so I worked at a series of startups. I worked at Smartsheet, which was sort of a Google Sheets project management type of tool. Um, and Smartsheet actually is still around today, going strong. I worked at Every, which was like a news aggregation site. I worked at Contour, which was a GoPro competitor. We were building a video sharing site for like GPS video. I worked at Aisle 50, which was we sort of internally affectionately referred to it as Groupon for groceries, and then got bought by Groupon. Um, I worked at Pretty Quick, which was a beauty booking site. So trying to connect people to beauty appointments for manicures, blowouts, massages, etc. Also bought by Groupon. Um, so by this point, I'm in Chicago. There's a strong gravitational pull towards Groupon in Chicago. It's such they've had some ups and downs, but a lot of people in the Chicago tech scene have filtered through Groupon. Um, and then from Groupon, I was there I was there with Pretty Quick for maybe 18 months, and then I ended up at Ascent. And so Ascent is a reg tech company. We use machine learning to help our customers understand and comply with their regulatory obligations. And I've been at Ascent for almost 7 years now, which is kind of crazy to me because my previous best was like 26 months
Wow.
at any of these companies. Um, Usually through some sort of natural circumstance. That's just, I wasn't trying to stay places for a short amount of time. Um, but I do feel like earlier in my career, it was actually really important to be getting these different types of experiences, seeing how things are done at different places, and getting that breadth. Um, and then at some point, I started to get questions about it in the interviews of like, "Are you only going to stay here for a year? and I figured I need to buckle down a little bit and try to be somewhere for a longer time, make a bigger impact. So yeah, Ascent has been great, and I've been at Ascent for this the same way I'm at any place for as long as I feel like I'm able to contribute and I'm able to keep learning.
Before we dive deeper into Ascent, having worked at so many different startups, are there any similarities and differences that you found made them successful in the way they're organized or the way they were run, or even the product themselves? Are there any commonalities that kind of showed through over time as the keys to success for them?
That's a great question. I would say some of the biggest differences between these startups is the target market, B2C versus B2B. The B2C, in a B2C startup, you're constantly fighting for the next dollar from every single customer. People are churning every single month. The lifetime value of a customer is pretty low because you once you acquire a customer, which is often expensive, that customer might only be around for 1 month, 2 months, 3 months, not a very long time. Whereas you go into a business sale, and a lot of times we'll use like a 5-year lifetime value for those customers. Once they make a purchase, it's hard. There's a big switching cost. Um, and so that definitely lends sort of a different dynamic to the company. Not that one is better than the other, but it definitely um, it kind of focuses you in a different way. And I think that's the thing for me that kind of differentiates um, a successful startup from an unsuccessful startup is the ability to focus. There's no shortage of good ideas. There's no and there's not a lot of data really to know which ideas are good, and there's not a lot of bandwidth to get stuff done. And so the the easiest thing to do in a startup is try to chase everything because everything seems promising. And once you get into it, everything seems hard because it is hard. Because if it was easy, someone would have done it already. So um, you really want to uh, try to find those things that seem like these like sure bets or like this is gonna like be easy for us. But as you give into that, you just spread your focus so thin, you never actually get anything done. And the real clarifying like concept that helps you create that focus is just staying really closely in touch with the customer. Ultimately, a business exists to solve a problem, and if you're not solving a problem, ultimately you don't have a business because no one's going to pay you if you're not doing something that's actually valuable for them. So in a consumer company, uh, you are kind of answering that question on sort of a month-to-month basis because people can very easily churn. In a B2B company, you end up with sort of longer and more individual relationships with a smaller number of customers, and so you're able to sort of get in deeper with them, understand them a little more deeply. It's nice to be able to have that close contact with your actual customers. The downside is you don't have as many of them, and so it's if somebody churns, that's a big deal. Whereas on the B2C side, you don't have that same personal relationship with a lot of your customers. You're still trying to reach out and do your user research, keep in touch, but ultimately there's always another consumer, and it really yeah again it's not good or bad. It just gives sort of a different feel to that focus.
Interesting. So now why don't we dive into Ascent a little bit and how you guys use AI to help companies stay in compliance?
Yeah. So at Ascent, I guess first of all, let me just kind of lay out the the problem of compliance. The problem is that regulation is complicated, and as a regulated company, you are very likely regulated, even as a small company, by at least a handful of regulators. It's not just one. And you get up to the level of being a global bank, you're regulated by hundreds or even thousands of regulators. The SEC rulebook is, I think, about 1.2 million words. If you're any sort of like financial services company, that's going to be an important thing for you. And so uh, the only way to really know what to do to stay compliant is to go read it. And it's just an immense task to handle manually. Um, and so that's the first problem with compliance is what does the rule book even say? Once you know what it says, you have to figure out what you're going to do about it. And over time, the rule books are changing. Right? Regulators are releasing new updates to the regulation that you have to stay on top of. They are, auditing people, fining people for various wrongdoing or breaches of the rules. That's something that's important to pay attention to. Where does the regulator put their attention? It's probably where you want to put your attention. And so there's an overwhelming amount of information that goes into it. And as a compliance officer, your job is to know everything about that information. And it's a really thankless task because there's logically there's no way to know if you miss something. You can feel good about the stuff you have, but there's really no way for you as an individual compliance officer to know that you actually found every single thing that's important to you. And our one of our founders was a compliance officer for a long time, and this is the kind of stuff that would keep him up at night, is worrying that he missed something. So at Ascent, we try to use machine learning to sort of tame the volume of that data. So we work with a few different types of data. We work with the regulations themselves, the actual text, the rules, and then we work with documents, which are when the regulator wants to communicate with the market, when they want to issue a rule update, when they want to inform everybody that they've fined somebody for something that has to be public so that they can't play favorites. It's all out in the open. Or if they just feel like saying something, somebody gave a speech, or they just they've been talking to companies and they just want to give you some advice. That all comes in the form of basically a PDF. And so we're working with those PDFs as well. So what we do is we take the rules, I would say, are a little more primary for us than the documents. We take the rules, we break them down into the individual obligations that are the things that you have to do. So any given rule, maybe, it could be 3, 5, 10 pages long. And so it's not something that you can just check off. But within that rule, there's dozens of things that are like individual things you have to do. So maybe there's a rule about reporting, and within there's a bunch of individual things about how you're going to send statements to your account holders. Or you have to send it every month. You have to include this type of information. You have to send it to their preferred communication method. Whatever it is. And so we're pulling out those individual obligations. So it's something that you could actually check off, basically. The rule book is about 30 to 40% obligations. The other 60 to 70% is what we call supporting information. And that includes things like definitions are really important. Also, any sort of like clarifications, exemptions, just different type of contextual information. And so when we break down the rule book, we're pulling out all those different types of information um, programmatically, and then figuring out, which type of information is this? What additional enrichment do we need to do to make it, that much more useful? For example, an obligation, maybe some obligations you have to do once a month, but some obligations you only have to do once a year, or just one time, right? Registering your business just one time. Um, so, we're pulling all these things out and creating these sort of individual, isolated components, building blocks that we can then put back together in new and more useful ways. So that as you're going through, reading any particular obligation or any rule in these regulations, we can connect those definitions so that you can hover on it and see what this term actually means. or so that you can see the context, right? What are the clarifications and exemptions that relate to this particular obligation? Um, from there, we also are trying to give people the information that they need to make this determination, this fundamental determination, is this something that I have to do or not? And that's a sort of a big part of compliance is making that decision and generating your particular obligation inventory for your company. Right? The SEC is talking about all kinds of different financial products, but as some hedge fund, maybe I'm only trading like agriculture futures, and I don't do anything with like metals. And there's a bunch of different regulations for metals that I don't have to worry about. So being able to get that stuff off the plate so that you can focus on the stuff that is relevant for you is sort of the first step in the process. So we're trying to first kind of get all that information of like what's the whole world of things that the SEC is saying to do, and then help you narrow it down to the things that you personally, as this company, need to be paying attention to.
What is
And again,
the
all the context that you need to actually understand that stuff.
what would be the risk to companies if they're out of compliance? Like what's kind of the worst case and what's the motivating factor to use a service like Ascent?
Yeah, great question. So the risks are huge, actually, and they've been increasing. So the fundamental risk is that you owe a fine. Um, Addressing the fine, however, often costs 10 times as much as the fine itself because you have to not only pay the fine, you have to then prove to the regulator that you've actually mitigated the thing that they fined you about. And so just going through, maybe you were like trying to like fight that enforcement in the first place, maybe it goes to court even. You have a judgment against you, now you have to pay it. Now you have to go also, update your process, update all your policies to make sure that you're not doing that thing anymore. And so the cost of being enforced is often, and the fines themselves are not small. We've seen billion-dollar fines in some of these like most egregious cases, and that's just the tip of the iceberg. Now, beyond that, there are certain things that a compliance officer can be held personally liable for, which I don't have really a background in financial services or certainly in compliance. Blew my mind that working at a company, I'm potentially personally liable for that company doing something wrong. Um, I guess I can see where it comes from. I guess as an employee of any company, I'm responsible for myself and my actions, but um, that's not something that's really hanging over my head as a software developer. Is this potential to be um, just sort of like have a personal liability, have a fine myself because of some regulation. So that's pretty tough for the compliance officers. Um, and then another example, I think it was um, I won't say the name because I don't remember exactly, and I would hate to say the wrong one. But there was a big news maybe a year or two ago where some global bank had been doing something wrong. The Justice Department ended up actually replacing directors on the board of that bank,
Wow.
um, which and those directors also are can be personally liable as well. So really, the sky's the limit in terms of the downside of not following the rules. Now, there is at the same time a little bit of sort of a center of the pack mentality, and it's a delicate balance for a compliance officer because you want to be compliant, but the more compliant that you are, often the more it costs to stay compliant. And so people are often trying to kind of toe that line between doing what feels reasonable and appropriate, but not doing too much because that's going to put you at a competitive disadvantage because your competitor's not spending that extra money on compliance, they're spending it on product development or whatever.
That was going to
Um,
be my next question is asking about at Ascent, do you guys ever look at the cost of staying in compliance versus the cost of the penalty of being out of compliance?
that'd be very interesting. We do not, um, but some of the things that we're not actively doing this, but I'm excited that the technology that we have sort of has the potential to do this. We have the rules, we have the enforcement actions, we have the obligations, um, we, and to some extent, we have the laws themselves. And so we can sort of trace through that chain of laws to regulation to enforcement and see how effective basically are the laws that were written? Like, how did those laws turn into regulation, and how did that regulation ultimately get enforced? And I'd be really interested to see, are the how the regulation maps to those laws, and how those enforcement actions map to that regulation. Maybe are we only enforcing against 2% of the rule book? Probably. Um, is that is that a problem or not? I don't know. I think the thing to me that is important about Ascent is that we ultimately are all better off. I personally think when we live in sort of a regulated society. Um, I think that there are a lot of things that we get from capitalism, from the free market, but without some regulation to put some guardrails on there, we tend to go towards some extremes, and I think we've been seeing that over the last decades. And so the conversation about regulation, though, is often very binary. Right? It's not very nuanced. Like, do we want more regulation or less regulation? The companies want less, the public wants more, or the government wants more, and it's not a productive conversation because we're just um, just kind of there's no middle ground really in that situation. And so I think a big contributing factor is just the volume. It's really hard to have a more nuanced conversation when the most salient factor about the regulation is how much of it there is. Um, I think when we can, again, sort of tame that volume, have a better understanding of what is actually in these regulations, we can kind of shift the conversation, hopefully, from quantity more towards quality.
I thought the thing you were saying about knowing and understanding how frequently some of these regulations are enforced, that seems like very, very valuable information to the companies being able to say, kind of make those informed decisions around whether to stay in compliance with certain regulations versus others. I think that's super interesting.
Yeah, the risk assessment is a really important part of the job of the compliance officer. Yeah.
With the new release of AI models like GPT-4 and GPT 3.5, and kind of the hype around AI recently, has that changed? You've been at Ascent for 7 years now. Have you noticed a difference in the day-to-day workings and also just the perception of the company in general?
Yeah. So I would say that these, recent LLMs have not really changed our day to day. We we predicate all of our the work that we do on like public LLMs, and we always have. And we go through a series of additional fine tunings that help us use those open source LLMs in our specific situations. And so every time a new one comes out, we're like, great, let's just like retrain everything, and then we're off to the races. We're just our stuff is better now. So um, so ultimately, we feel like it's good for us that these models keep coming along. We're not really worried so much about the possibility that a model will that someone else would be able to replicate what we do with one of these models. And that's because of a number of things. It's because of the fine tuning that we do, but it's also um, a couple other like really important points. One is that it's not enough to just have the answer. You have to have the answer in a way that you can actually give to someone and like help them do their job. And that's a really non-trivial part of it, the product that you wrap around the AI. Um, and the other really important part of it is I lost it. Sorry, I totally lost it.
No worries.
Product. Oh, I remember. Sorry. So the other really important factor is that these um, generative models by themselves suffer significantly from hallucinations. And we don't really see a world where that's not happening. And when it comes to these like legal, financial, compliance type of professions, that's not sufficient. So we've actually seen recently there was a lawyer who turned in a bunch of like legal work to the court, and he had done that work based off of some GPT responses and had ended up citing legal precedent that didn't actually exist. It sounded convincing. You go read through it, you're like, oh yeah, totally that precedent. But when the judge got a hold of it, um, this lawyer was pretty embarrassed, and I don't know what kind of um, what's the word? Not retribution. I don't know what kind of consequences he faced, but certainly not a good look to be going into court trying to cite something that doesn't exist. So that's exactly the same situation that we find ourselves in compliance. Is as Ascent, we are trying very hard and pride ourselves on providing our customers information that is in fact true, correct, comprehensive, complete. So um, even if some other company could use a GPT model to answer a bunch of legal questions, the veracity of those answers right now is just too low. And we think sort of fundamental, like just based on the fundamental nature of those models, um, it's very hard to get truth just out of it empirically. And so that's also why the fine tunings that we do and the other sort of QA practices that we have and data integrity approaches that we use are really critical for going from something that is um, has this potential to be incorrect to something where we can actually stand behind the data that we're putting into the world.
I'm curious, are you able to delve in a little bit about how you minimize those hallucinations?
Sure. So we're we're edging a little bit into secret sauce territory, but what I will say is a lot of the tasks that we use machine learning for are are very specific tasks, classifications, for example. And so when you try to create a model like ChatGPT that can take in such a breadth of inputs and give you back such a breadth of outputs. Um, it's really the breadth that is what starts to create that potential for sort of out of bounds responses. And so when you really tightly scope the problem down to say, the inputs that we're going to give here, um, I guess I'll just use a non-Ascent example. If you're going to give someone a loan, um, you're going to put in information about their credit history, and you're going to get out like a yes or no. Should we give this person a loan? Or maybe you're going to get out of confidence, of how likely are they to pay back the loan over time. And so it's a much simpler problem, and there just sort of like isn't room for there's room for like statistical variance, but there's no room for the model to just kind of like make something up in that situation. Um, yeah, so I guess that's It's a little obtuse maybe, but I think that's sort of the best way to think about it.
Push too far. We don't want any competition popping up out of our roles. Um, yeah, why don't you talk a little bit about your responsibilities as chief architect and kind of what the day-to-day looks like? Because I think a lot of our listeners are kind of aspiring to be or have a similar position to what you hold now. So I think that might be kind of interesting.
Yeah, so I'll talk a little bit about sort of my evolution into this role. My career, I started just as a software developer, and for a long time, I was really focused on just being a really good software developer. And to me, that meant um, trying to solve problems, trying to deliver value, and trying to get that breadth, right? Um, at the same time, there's only we can only know so much as an individual person. So um, there is there's sort of a limit to the breadth. Um, but I think just getting those different types of experiences earlier in my career was really helpful because now I can look back on these different situations and see the parallels, the things that went well, that went poorly, and sort of bring all that forward into um, the current situation that I'm in. Um, at some point, I felt like I had kind of not topped out exactly, but I wasn't feeling the same satisfaction of learning more about different types of technology and getting deeper on development in and of itself. It just wasn't quite as fulfilling as it had been. And so that's when I started looking more towards management and more explicit leadership positions. I found that in the startups that I was in, they were so small, there were really only two levels. There's like founders and developers. And so I figured, I can either go to a bigger company where there are more levels and I can kind of work my way up, or I can go to like one of the smallest companies I can find, kind of make that jump into sort of the executive level and grow from there. And so that's what I ended up doing. And so um, I started moving into like CTO type roles, um, and learning a little bit about management. Um, it's a very different, it- totally different skill set, basically. Um, and honestly, I've been doing that for almost 10 years now, and I'm only just now feeling like I'm actually kind of like figured out like how to do that kind of job. It's been a really tough learning curve for me personally. So I think the things, as I think back, the things that kind of helped me get to this point, um, someone someone put it really succinctly for me recently that really the best thing to do for your career at any given point is just to make sure that you're like delivering value. That like what it is that your that your team is trying to achieve, that your company is trying to achieve, and getting involved in the things that are actually making a difference. And that means you have to like actually ship stuff, right? Like and when you start to have that mindset, um, you start to find that software isn't always the solution. And the reason that I was kind of trying over time to kind of rise through these different levels of responsibility was in large part because I wanted to be able to have um, different levers to pull to solve any given problem. And when I started out, I had technical levers. And then as I kind of understand a little more how companies work, you work a little bit more with a product team, you start to, I don't know that I could do that job, but I kind of understand that mindset a little more. And so I can at least suggest like, oh, in this situation, this customer wants this thing. It's actually really hard to build that thing. What if we gave them this other thing that's easier to build, but it's not exactly what they asked for, but it's going to satisfy their underlying need in a different way. Right? So now you found a product solution to the problem, and you didn't actually have to write any code. And so to me, that kind of evolution, kind of broadening those types of levers that you have available is really important as well as you move up because ultimately, um, as you move up, you have to be working with a wider and wider breadth of people. Initially maybe it's just your technical team, but then you're working with product, then you're working with CX, then you're working with sales and marketing. Ultimately you're kind of embedded in the entire sort of ethos of the company, even if you're not doing that sales and marketing yourself, but being aware of how your company is trying to go to market is really informative, really important context for you as a developer because we're making dozens and dozens of like tiny decisions every day, and those decisions are pretty impactful because ultimately we're building the product itself. And so what we come out with, that's what people see, that's what people understand, that's as our vision. And so we do have as developers a lot of opportunity to make these like subtle adjustments in how we're presenting the ideas that we have. And the more you understand the problem space, all the different facets of it, not just the technical facet, the more effective that you're ultimately able to be. Um,
What do you think is the optimal path to CTO or chief architect or kind of these management positions? Is it always, do you have to start as a great developer and then progress to the business side, or are there kind of alternate paths to get to that spot?
it's a good question. I personally went the developer route, and I guess I would say I do feel like I'm a really good developer, but I feel like the reason I'm a really good developer is because of all that context, like contextual stuff that I talked about. Not because I'm like the best at code. I'm like good at code, but it's not the thing that I felt like was ever my biggest strength. Um, and I think that to be a technical leader, it is pretty important to have a pretty detailed understanding of the technology. You don't necessarily have to be able to like write every single piece of code, but um, I it it's hard for me to speak beyond my experience, but I have a hard time imagining being effective as a technical leader without having the benefit of my technical background. Um, Certainly, I've met very um, effective technical leaders who maybe didn't come from that development background, but I think at least just having sort of a taste of it, or getting your hands dirty with some side projects, like one way or another, you do have to understand some of the developer mindset, I think, to be able um, to lead developers effectively.
Do you think this is kind of a reiteration of the same question, but uh, does excellence as a developer, is that crucial, or do you think having like that fundamental understanding, but maybe not being the best developer, or do you think you kind of need that super sturdy foundation to rise up and be a lead?
So it's a very philosophical question that, and I appreciate the question. And I do have a couple of very philosophical answers. One way that I would think about this is, when I think about what makes a great developer, the code is almost secondary. The core activity to me of development is conceptual. We are thinking about a problem, we're coming up with solutions to that problem, and then we're writing those solutions down. Yes, we're writing them in code, but the sort of core work is to solve the problem. And then I guess another piece of the core work is to communicate the solution. And that communication, the reason code is hard is because that communication is we're trying to communicate both with a computer and with other humans, including our future selves. And so to me, I really start approaching any technical problem through things like the domain model or the data model, rather than too much about sort of the underlying infrastructure that's going to support it, because the domain model or the data model, these are the core concepts in the world. Like, what are the nouns? What are the verbs? What are the things that we're working with? How do they fit together? What are the sort of the dynamics of that system? Um, that type of understanding, the ability to approach a problem, kind of pull it apart into these sort of like mid-level abstractions, to me is sort of the core of development. And then, yes, absolutely, you have to be able to translate those abstractions into code so that the computer can run it, and so that everyone else on your team can participate in that sort of shared evolution of our understanding. Um, but th that's that to me is sort of the the core activity. And when you talk about excellence, I also think that my other sort of the other side of this coin is that this is the way that I perceive my own unique value. This is the way that I think about software, and that has been really valuable for me. And to some extent, that's all I can say about it. I don't know if that's a useful way for other people to go about it, but I think that as I've been sort of developing this perspective on software, I've also been trying to develop my perspective on what is my own unique value. And for me, it's not code. For me, my unique value is about being able to see these problems, sort of see the bigger picture, and bring all that together to have sort of a flexible way to form these solutions. And the challenge, though, is it's really hard to spot your unique value, I think, because it's stuff that feels easy to you. And so you're like, oh, that, like, whatever, like, that's easy. Like, why would that be my unique value? It's your unique value because it feels hard to other people. And so you don't actually like really experience your unique value as like, oh, this like mind-blowing strength that you have. It's only other people that experience it that way. And so it's just like hard to kind of figure out what that is. And so that's another reason that I talk a lot about breadth early in a career, because I think the only way to find that unique value that you have is through breadth. It's a pattern question. You can't really answer it directly. You can't just like think about it and figure it out. You have to go just try a bunch of stuff and kind of see where are you gravitating towards. The things that you're interested in are valuable. Whether or not they sort of the perception of them, the fact that you care about it is what's going to make that be a unique value for you. And um, yeah, so it's it's something that I think it's worth keeping an eye on. I don't know that it's worth sort of thinking about that on a daily basis, but certainly as you're going to put together your resume, go to the next job, whatever, it's something, every year, 6 months, whatever cycle, important to just take a step back and think about what are the things that I felt really good about, what are the things that I was really interested and excited about, and just anytime you get feedback from people that's like, oh, great job with that, or like, oh, that's really hard for me, um, it's like it's a subtle signal, but ultimately being able to find that and lean into it, I think, um, is is sort of the best way to find your own path, sort of through those different levels.
I really, really like that. That's super interesting. Do you have any other advice for young people looking to have a life or career that they can be proud of?
Yeah, I think I guess I have a couple of thoughts about it. One thing, maybe the most important thing, I'll just say burnout sucks. Don't get burned out. Easier said than done. Um, but it's easier said than done because the sort of the work culture that we have is happy to take everything from you. And um, not maliciously, just like if you're going to work hard, people are going to be like, "Oh, cool, you like did this thing that was like helped us." Um, and it's also like you maybe should be working hard, right? Especially early in your career, trying to like gain a foothold, learn these new things, kind of figure out what the world's about. Um, and so it's a very slippery slope, though, from like working too hard into, or from working hard to working too hard. And it's a lesson that has been hard for me to learn personally. I feel like I'm still learning it. Um, the sort of the pace of just society in general actually has really exacerbated it as well. And I was just reading a book, just even in the last, 20, 30, 40 years, we went from sort of purely, you go to work, you just like talk to the people around you and get stuff done, to email, to Slack. And so the pace of communication, and the pace of interrupt, context switching. These are all things that have just exploded, and it's unfortunately these are the things that ultimately make us anxious and make it hard to actually do our best work. And so, um, especially early on, I think it can be daunting to try to find just like some calm within that to actually sit down and focus on something, um, or to put it away at the end of the day and go home. And I've, I moved to LA a couple years ago. I have this balcony now. I have like some plants on it. I wasn't really able to have plants as much in Chicago, and it's been great to just like, every day go and check on my plants, water them a little bit, just um, see what they need. And it's been really surprisingly grounding for me to just have this other thing that doesn't have any particular like productive value, except I just like it. Um, so I don't know. It's hard. It's hard. It's just hard to prioritize that stuff. Um, but ultimately, you're the only person who's going to take care of you in that way. Nobody else is going to tell you when to stop, when to take a break. Um, and to some extent, they can't. Right? They don't know you. They don't know if it's time to take a break. But it's an important thing to try to be cognizant of for yourself.
Do you have any advice for walking that balance? Like something I struggle with is it's I think it's important. I think and a lot of people struggle with this is it's early in the career, you want to work hard so you gain those footholds, but also you want to enjoy the moment, you want to not waste time with friends and family. Do you have any advice for walking that line?
Man, um, I wish I had more for sure. Um, I could use some myself, I think. Um, I guess I would say one thing that I think about, um, is I would again just bring it back to like, what do you actually want to be doing? Do you want to be working all the time? Maybe. And that's if that's what you want to do, that's go ahead, right? Like, um, but if you what you want to be doing is like spending time with your friends or your family or whatever, like just give that as much weight in your life as work, because it's so easy for work to feel like the most important thing. And I get a lot of fulfillment from my work. I get a lot of like sort of identity and satisfaction from my work. And it took a long time to sort of catch up with me, but it's ultimately, that can only take you so far. Right? That's only a part of your life, even though it can feel like it's your entire life. And um, so yeah, I think you just have to, um, just step back every once in a while, reflect, think about the different parts of your life, and think about whether or not they're in balance, whether or not they're in the balance that you want them to be in. Right? Balance doesn't mean everything equal all the time, but it does mean that all the things that are important to you get some time. And I don't know, it can be hard to figure out how to fit those things together, but I think unless you know what those things are in the first place, you're never gonna achieve the balance. And so just a little reflection um, once in a while, I think can just help you at least kind of figure out what are the things that I care about, and from there you can start to figure out, more concretely, how can I bump this one up? Where can I be a little more efficient at something to sort of change the balance?
I think that's something a lot of people, myself included, need to hear and need to practice more often.
Man, I need to hear it every 3 weeks.
The last little question or tangent, while we have time, another kind of philosophical question is, what do you see as the future of AI working in the space? What do you see in the next 5, 10 years? What should we be excited for? What should we be scared for? What are kind of the skills we should develop to survive? And what use cases and innovations are you most excited for? Kind of a massive list of questions, but pick whichever you choose.
Yeah. So as I think to the future, honestly, I don't spend a ton of time thinking so far to the future because um, in a startup, at best, you're thinking like 2 years out. And much more likely, you're thinking like 12 months, 6 months, 3 months out. Um, so I spend a lot of time focused on the very short-term future. Um, but in terms of the sort of the bigger picture, maybe I'll eat these words later, but I personally right now don't feel like we're particularly close to any sort of general artificial intelligence. Um, I think that the technologies that we have right now are um, fundamentally sort of interpolative. They can take everything that we know and find like little, sort of connections between them, but they're not actually, we call it generative AI, but it's actually not really generating anything. It's just kind of like remixing stuff we already have. Um, it doesn't actually, it doesn't have any sort of internal representation of the world, really. And so, I sort of think of like, would you let a really smart parrot be your lawyer? Like, probably not. Um, would you let your lawyer have a really smart parrot on its desk? I don't know, I guess if the lawyer felt like that was helpful. Um, so I think that's really where I kind of see things going is less of like this overarching sort of like singularity type of change, and more just that we're going to be able to continue doing a certain type of thing faster and more efficiently. Um, Now that I mean that in and of itself, like we're getting to the point of having self-driving cars. We're actually like doing like pilot programs of self-driving trucking and like self-driving taxis and stuff. That's huge. Like those are big industries. A lot of people's jobs are going to be affected as that stuff comes more and more online. Um, we're also going to have a lot more safety on the roads, right? So is it good? Is it bad? It's kind of hard to say. It's definitely going to be different, and I think we're going to continue seeing a lot of that upheaval. But we also, the hype cycle is just insane. And the when I think about the hype cycle, just to bring it back full circle, technology is here to solve problems. No one really cares about technology unless it's solving a problem. Or maybe it's cool, but we're not going to gain widespread adoption on something that's just cool. It's going to have to solve a problem. The hype cycle says that one technology will solve all problems, and the hype cycle like people, yeah, people get excited about stuff, and I get excited about stuff too, and we want to think about all the different ways that this new idea can affect our future. But ultimately, the hype cycle collapses when we find that this new technology, like every single other technology before it, will solve one or two problems. Um, and so I think we're um, maybe starting to get towards, I don't want to say the end of the hype cycle, but there was sort of a huge hype spike around ChatGPT, GPT 3.5, 4.0, et cetera. But now we see that there's been some very recent reporting around giving wider context windows doesn't actually improve performance. Or later models, later iterations of some of these models went from being able to solve certain problems 98% of the time to 2% of the time. So these are things that we really still don't understand, and so it's really hard to make these predictions. And so um, when yeah, so I guess again, it just comes back to what are the problems we're actually solving with this stuff. I feel like I had another uh, one of your other questions also intrigued me, but I forget what it was. But
One of the other ones was use case you're most excited for when it comes to AI. Innovations we'll see in the next 10, 15 years. And one other thing I'm curious about is AGI achievable in your mind? And what is like a rough timeline in your head?
oh, I really have no idea. I think I don't I don't know I don't know if it's achievable, but at the same time, I also would have told you that the the statistical approaches that we're using now seem kind of magical. Um, it's in some ways we're doing simple things at a large scale, and that's I guess I shouldn't I shouldn't call it too simple, but we're doing like small operations that sort of in mass combine into something sort of that feels greater than the sum of the parts. Um, and I wouldn't have told you that that was going to happen either. So I feel like it's hard to know. It does seem to me, I go around my life and all the time I'm like I'm doing something and I'm like a robot couldn't do that. And I don't know, I'll just be like eating chips or something. I'm like a robot's not going to eat chips. And does that what does that mean? Like I don't know what that means. But I guess it's just maybe it's just a way to reassure myself um, that that I'm sort of like fundamentally different from these technologies. And um, I think the thing that you were asking about is sort of what are the skills that are gonna like protect us? And I think it's those skills that are uniquely human. I think it's it's the creativity that we have, our ability um, to sort of like select the context that we're working with, um, the sort of the serendipity that comes with being human, um, and yeah, communication, being able to empathize, to understand people, because ultimately everything in business is, I know it doesn't necessarily seem like it, but at the end of the day, it does kind of come down to empathy, right? Because like we've said, tech solves problems. If you're not solving a problem, ultimately you don't really have a business, and you can only solve a problem if you understand it. And so um, these are the things to me that are interesting. This is why I like technology actually. I said that I got into software for the fast feedback, but what I didn't emphasize is just like the actual like user communication, being able to go not just solve someone's problem, but talk to them about their problem, try to understand them and what they're going through, so that I can then sort of apply these skills that I have to making their life better. And that whole sort of suite of things of empathy, understanding, and creativity and communication, I think um, are ultimately the things that are going to prevail.
Well, thank you. Thanks, Chris. I really like that. It definitely is a more optimistic note than some of our. Most of the podcasts are optimistic, but most of them have us having a little bit of an existential crisis of what it means to be human and if we'll be around in 50 years. So I definitely like.
Yeah, I mean, I have the crisis too, but I definitely I am an optimist.
Well, thank you. We'll leave it there.